critical part of international business really is making certain you earn money and you count the money. It's called accounting, but you have this whole different dimension with foreign currency involved. It plays a big role because there's a variance between often the home office and actually the host country. They're often in different currencies, and really because of that, you'll have a variation, a fluctuation in the value between the two countries. Just for entertainment purposes, there's something new happening out there that's really only come to really in the last couple decades called the sovereign wealth funds, where investment funds are controlled by the government. Here in the United States, we always focus in on any kind of funds are controlled by the citizenry, except for the fact we always have the Federal Reserve System nosing into business on a regular basis in the process. So you'll see this becoming more common throughout the entire world, where governments, they investigate a return on their assets for their citizens to diversify their national risk. Kind of an interesting thing where the government tries to act as a business on behalf of its citizens. It's an odd twist of a government turning towards privatization, or maybe it's a secret way to control. Either way, that really is the government trying to earn money by investing in the private sector. The funds have objectives often that sometimes is to maximize returns, but it may have something to reinforce green energy, some type of national agenda as well in the process as you go through. When it comes to accounting on an international basis, all accounting, no matter what happens, provides financial data to make decisions. That's why you track the money as you go through. It's also how you sit down and make money in the process. You got to account for how you spend the money and so on. International accounting adds the steps you would normally expect. Foreign government reporting is needed, differences in finances across borders to address regulations in the home office, and the host country is needed as well as you go through that. But a lot of times, these foreign currency transactions, they're sales and loans made by a U.S. company. They're recorded specifically as revenues, expenses, assets, or liabilities, a typical income statement or a balance sheet as you go through, and of course, a statement of cash flows. We always focus in on having three different types of reports: your balance sheet, your income statement, and your statement of cash flows as you go through. Now, when you add the dimension of foreign currency-based transactions, how do you count for that? Do you count for it the day you receive it? Do you count for it at month end? You do your trial balance as you go through. How do you go about doing that? So we need to have that dialogue here to give you a flavor. But then again, every company that you work in may have a little bit different flavor, but let me prepare you for the aspect of the fact that in the United States, we have this currency over here. And if you're working over in Thailand, okay, you have a different currency. It is not the US dollar. It is a totally different currency. And the fact that currency may be valued to the US dollar one way at the beginning of the month, and at the end of the month, it'll have a different value amount in it. So when you receive the money, if you receive it on the 1st of the month or the 15th or the 30th, you may have a different currency valuation on each one of those 3 different days as you go through. So how do you account for it? Okay, so that's what this section is about. We talk about the aspect of when you receive it, okay, the current method, or you'd have current spot rates, which is pretty much the standard rate of doing it. But for the most part, you're going to make certain when you receive the money at month end, when you actually post it, you sit down there, and that's when you sit down and count for the money and the differences in the money in the transaction as you go through. The temporal method is valued on the spot rate. In other words, is carried at that rate right there. They're translated into the exchange rate at that moment, or the functional currency, which is the US dollar in our case as you go through. So you really have to sit down there and pay attention that you're going through, you're using the foreign currency, you evaluate it at the temporal method, in other words, at the spot rate of its worth in that country, and then sit down there and report it back that way. But a lot of times you have to convert it over into the primary currency of the business or the home office as you go through. In the US, we followed a thing called GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, GAAP. That is the standard lingo in accounting. That is the rules that we go by as you go through. You have to deal with the GASB as well, general accounting standards and practices as you go through. The rest of the world follows a thing called the International Accounting Standards Boards. They're really similar in a lot of different ways, but it's really based upon social obligation and principles and everything else. So it's not the technical part that we have, it's more of a general guideline as you go through. Disclosure practices are very, very different as you go through. What we have pretty much in the Western civilization, from the United States to the UK and so on, is a very open, we're very transparent about what we're doing. But when you go to Switzerland, Switzerland prides itself on being very secretive in all the financial transactions that it does as you go through. And they have some super secrecy laws they have to protect disclosure of almost everything that happens in there, from the amount you put into a parking meter to how much money you sit there and toss into the bank account, or the secret vaults they have that nobody knows about as you go through. So Sidney Gray comes up, and this is in your chapter as you go through. He talks about this matrix as you go through, as to secrecy over here and openness over here in the process as you go through. It just depends on the country as you're going through. But now we're talking about it from an academic perspective here in a classroom setting. But when you go into those different settings, you'll have a whole different aspect of, oh, this is really real over here. So how much can you disclose if you're trying to research actually as to how you go about doing that? Oh my gosh, you sitting over here, it becomes something real for you when you dive into the culture of that country, because the culture is going to affect how they report things out in the accounting system. Each one is different. And really, before you take an assignment overseas, get that whole aspect of the accounting, Pat, even if it's not your turf, if you're in marketing, because if you're going to sell a product in another country, it's got to be accounted for according to a determination. And if you have an existing international company, it'll have already defined how they do that. If it's a brand new field office, you may be one of the people helping prepare how you're going about doing that. Exactly when do you count the money, and what is the money worth, and how do you go about tracking it? So know about the sovereign wealth funds that governments are out there, and they have different investments they make on behalf of their citizens with the money, sometimes to make money for the citizens, but usually it's more about focusing in on a principle of investing into a certain part of the culture to help the citizens themselves gain benefits from it. And then also the foreign currency transaction, it plays a significant role in international accounting, and that we use GAAP, and that there's also an international accounting standards board as you go through. Take care.